pandemic edition. Today we're going to talk a little bit about layout. So it always fascinates me how we can build a whole residential home out of just like a pile of lumber. So we order the lumber, looks like it's a pile, bunch of 2x4s, bunch of 2x6, and next thing you know, with some pretty basic steps, we end up with a complete structure. So it's fascinating. It never ceases to blow me away. So what I want to talk about is with the basics today. We're going to talk a little bit about wall layout. Why do we place the studs the way we do? How do we go about doing that? And also we'll touch a little bit about the floor systems too. So it's going to be a little bit of math, a little bit of measuring, a little bit of thinking, not difficult math, so don't worry about that. So first thing we're going to do is I think we'll just start off looking at a tape measure and we'll go from there. So first off, we're going to make some assumptions. We're assuming that our plan is an 8-foot, calls for 8'1" walls. 8 feet is equal to 96 inches. So we can pull out our tape measure and we can check that quite easily. Every 12 inches, we have a new foot. And we'll go all the way to 8 feet. What we're looking for, we can see we've got 96 inches there. Our plan calls for 8'1", so that's 97 inches we have to work with. Yeah. So that being said, how do we get to what we need to get to? First thing we have is our bottom sill plates. We can call this a sill plate. Some people call it a sole plate. Some people call it a base plate. It's at the bottom, so I like to call it a bottom plate. That way you don't have to think too hard. You can call it anything you like. Basically, that's our bottom plate. Interior walls, typically, it's going to be a 2x4, right? Exterior walls, traditional standard construction, like this house, is going to be 2x6, okay? Away we go. We all know that a 2x4 and a 2x6 is 1.5 inches thick, okay? So that gives us 1.5 inches. All right, and then we're going to have, we'll talk about how we're going to space these things, is we'll have our wall studs. Okay, whether they're 2x4 or 2x6, they will rise vertically and they'll be attached to our bottom plate. 2x4s, 2x6s, we like to use pre-cut. We call them wall studs. That's what we order, that's what they come. Okay, so for 8-foot walls, they are 92 inches and 5/8. Let's just forget about that for a second. A little bit of a concept here. Let's just call this 92.5. Okay, all right. At the top, just modify this a little bit so it touches. We have another 2x4 or 2x6, depending on what type of wall we're building. And we have another one. 2x4 or 2x6. This is referred to as the double top plate. Okay? That kind of references both of them. Double top plate. I like to refer to the first one, the lower one on the wall, as the top plate, and the uppermost top plate, the cap plate. You'll see that later on when we start talking about intersecting our walls to gain strength. It's just nice to call it the cap plate. To differentiate, it makes a difference between the two double top plates, just for so we know what we're talking about. In any case, we know that those are either 2x4s or 2x6s. They're going to add up. There will be 1.5 inches each. 1.5 inches plus 1.5 inches is 3. So I warned you about the math. Super tough stuff. So, all right. So we'll write our 3 inches over here. 3 inches. So now we can start doing a little bit of math. We've got 3 inches, 92.5, 1.5 inches. Okay, so inch and a half, we can make it quick. We can go 3 plus 1.5, so we know that's 4.5 plus 92.5 gives us 1, 6, 7, 97 inches, which we all know is equal to 8 foot 1 inch. Easy peasy. That's how we get our height. 9 foot walls, a little bit different. We have a pre-cut wall stud is would be 104.5 inches. Okay. Now, here's the big secret, and you would never be expected to draw this on a plan. I doubt you'll ever see it on a plan. But in our lumber industry, the pre-cut wall studs are just a little bit longer than that 1/2 inch, than that 81.5 inch. So pre-cut wall studs are 92 and 5/8. There's an extra 1/8 of the difference. So the difference between a 1/2 inch, because remember, really a 1/2 inch is, well, really it's 8/16, right? Or we could call that 4/8, right? Okay, so we have 1 extra 8, so 4/8 is really the same as a 1/2 inch. If you look at your tape measures, right, you could just count the 1/8 on there, right? So we add an 1/8 to the 4/8, that gives us that 5/8 mark. Okay, so that should be, if you've all been practicing with your tapes, that I said you should probably borrow, beg, use, purchase if necessary, to get to understand how this thing works. This is why it's important. Okay, so we'll deal a little bit about with that later in a later exercise, but you'll need to read this bad boy at some time, and it's just not that hard, and it will make you a better architectural technologist because you'll know what you're talking about. So not to say that we don't work in metric too, but we are talking about residential construction, and we like to work in imperial. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. Bottom plate, 1.5 inches. Pre-cut wall stud, for all intents and purposes, 92.5 to get our 8 foot 1. And then 3 inches with the double top plate consisting of a top plate and the cap plate. So that gives us our 97 inches, 8 foot 1. And then I threw a curveball at you. Actually, there's an extra 1/8 there. So technically speaking, our whole wall, if everything was perfect in a perfect world, it's actually 8 foot 1 and 1/8 tall. Okay, don't get hung up on it. There's a bunch of reasons why we frame the wall 8 foot 1 in the first place. First place is we've got things like drywall going on the ceiling, which takes up a 1/2 inch right there. They've got flooring goes in the house, so the idea is it finishes at 8 foot walls. Same thing for 9 foot walls are really framed roughly from subfloor to the underside of the trusses, or the top of the wall, same thing, that extra inch. And just the lumber, I've heard a lot of reasons why. It's either expansion or contraction, shrinkage, longitudinal along the wall stud. So, okay, just a little bit about the terminology of the lumber that we're working with. So let's just say 2x4s, this will apply to 2x6 as well. If you go to the lumber yard or the counter at Home Depot or Rona and you ask them for 8 foot 2x4s, they may ask you, which do you want? Do you want 8 foot 2x4s, or 8 footers they may call them, or do you want 8 foot wall studs? Now here's the difference. 8 footers, they may say. What they're talking about there is they want to know, do you want a 2x4 that is 8 feet long or 96 inches in length? That's how long it is. Put tape on it, that's how long it is, because they make those. If they ask you, do you want 8 foot wall studs? This is where it's a little bit weird. An 8 foot wall stud is not 8 feet long. We just learned that. 8 foot wall stud. Okay, it's 92 and 5/8. So it's shorter, okay, by 3.5 inches or whatever. Okay, so yeah, so you'll be all cool and hip. You go, hey man, I want some 8 foot wall studs. You don't even have to mention this 92 and 5/8. They'll know exactly what you mean, and they'll know that you're cool and you know a little bit about building houses. Just that easy, just that simple. So, okay, another little series here. We just want to talk a little bit about spacing regimes. Okay, so in other words, how far apart do we put our lumber when we want to build a wall or trusses or a floor? Okay, we like to base everything on that 8 feet again. Now we're not talking about vertical wall space when we talk about the length of what makes up a wall. We're talking more about what we're going to cover it with. Okay, so we all know that when we want to cover our walls, we need to sheathe. Sheathe is a word that means to cover. So in the old days when we rode around on horses with swords trying to kill each other, the knights in shining armor, their big sword went in a sheath, and the sheath covers the knife blade. I don't know if that's where the word comes. It's just a cool story to tell. Anyway, we need to sheathe it, okay? Sometimes you'll hear people say sheeting things. So in other words, I sheeted the wall. Sounds more nautical to me, but either or we know what you're talking about. I think correct, it probably is sheath. At least that's what I would write. That's what I would use, okay? Sometimes I'll say sheet when I'm in a hurry, okay? So I like to have exceptions with rules. Okay, so how do we do that? Is on center. We're talking about on center measurement. So what we're talking about is we're talking about studs, trusses, floor joists, those types of things. Where are we going to put them and how far apart are we going to put them? We don't really worry about the space that's in between so much. So when we say on center, what we're doing is we're finding the center of whatever it is. Now, fortunately, most of that stuff, 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x8s, dimensional lumber, is 1.5 inches thick. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to understand that it's 1.5 inches thick, and if we divide that by 2, it's pretty simple math. We know that we've got 3/4 of an inch. Okay, boom, done. That's all we have to understand. Now, here's what we want to do. We want to lay out a wall. So we mentioned a little earlier that we had to have that bottom plate. Okay, and I'm not going to install any studs on this wall yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my top plate, not the cap plate, just one of them. Okay, so I'm going to grab that and I'm going to stick it right on here too. So I've got them laid together. Okay, now what I want to do, let's say my plan says all my walls need to be 24 inches on center. It's really nice if you mark that on the plan, guys, especially in residential. They usually, sometimes the spec sheet is not there when the poor framer sometimes have to find that out. The house will be estimated to 24 inches on center, and that's pretty much standard these days, but there are other rules to get us to the same thing. Actually, I'll write those down. So we get 12 inches on center, works really well with 8 feet. 16 inches on center works really well with 8 feet. And 24 inches on center works really well with 8 feet for walls and things like that, okay? They all terminate at 96 inches, which is 8 feet. Actually, before I get into that, why 8 feet? Okay, 8 feet seems to be, we're all pretty hung up on that. Because when we sheathe things, okay, we sheathe them with OSB, oriented strand board, or plywood, or whatever it is. On the inside of the house, we like using drywall, which is 8 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet, in denominations of 2 feet, typically. Okay? If I get my studs all in the right spot, what I'm trying to do is be able to apply the OSB in 8-foot lengths so it lands halfway through a stud, or a truss, or a joist. This is the idea, okay? So, if you take 96 inches, and you divide it by 12, you'll get 8, right? If you divide it by 16, you'll get, oh gee, now I'm testing myself, I don't even know. But if you divide 16 and 24, you're going to land, they go in easily. So if I put all my studs at 17.5 inches apart, you can't separate those equally along that 8 feet, okay? So, that's kind of embarrassing, but let's just find out. So if I go 16 on center, I couldn't answer the question. So 8 studs every 12 inches, 4 every 24. If 16 would be 16, 32, 48, 64, and then 80. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so ooh, that's embarrassing. But anyway, and then you have to include the first and the last as well. But in any case, don't worry about it. They land halfway through. Okay, so here's my bottom plate. And our top plate. We don't need the cap plate. What we've done is we've put them together, okay, and we make sure that they stay together. We're gonna take our tape measure. We're gonna hook it on here. I'm gonna make a great big tape measure. And we're gonna go like this. We're gonna pull it out. Let's say we just pulled it out to 10 feet. Because what I'm interested in is back here, 8 feet or 96 inches. What I'm going to do is I'm gonna come to my first mark, because remember we're looking for 24 on center. We're going to come to 24 inches. We're going to subtract 3/4 of an inch. And we're going to put a mark on the wood. Okay? Right like that. And then what we're going to do is, because we subtracted from where 24 inches is, we're going to draw a line through that. We're going to put an X to the right side of the line because we subtracted from 24. We'll do this on a tape with some wood too, so it'll be easy. We continue doing that. So every 2 feet. So the next 2 feet is 48. Okay, let's subtract 3/4 of an inch, which what I'm looking for there is 47 1/4. We'll find that on our tape, we'll draw a line in the lumber, and we'll put an X right there. That way, later on, when we attach a stud where the X is, so we don't have to do any measuring or anything, it's already been done for us and marked, we'll put the stud there, drive our fasteners into it, 3 1/4 inch framing nails typically, and it'll be in the middle of 24. And because we know that half of that is to 3/4 of an inch. Okay, so what happens is when we get to our 96 inch mark, or 8 feet, or the same size of the sheathing that we want to use, we've subtracted 3/4 of an inch from 96, so 95 1/4. Okay? So what ends up happening is when we put the sheet on, the sheet will land halfway through. So here's the other side of that stud, or that 2x4 or 2x6, whatever you're using. And then here's our sheet of OSB. Okay? There's our 96 inch sheathing material. Okay? The first one, this is what starts it all. The first one starts right flush at the end. We don't do any measuring there. We just put the wall stud there, okay? And this throws a lot of people off because people start getting hung up about how much space is in between the studs. I really don't care, but in this case, it's worth noting that this space between the very first stud and the second stud is actually less than all the other ones, okay? Because you can't have this hanging over, all right? Now, if you start thinking about that, if we're starting a wall that's 60 feet long, we subtract that 3/4 the whole way only one time, and that's when we begin the wall, right here, okay? If you subtract it again, or if you stop subtracting it somewhere along that line, then the sheets of sheathing will not land halfway through that stud, okay? Don't worry if you don't get it. We're going to do this on a couple pieces of lumber, and then if we can, we have the house here. If we can take a look at that, put a tape measure on it, and see what happens. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. Spacing regimes. Common, 12 inches on center, 16 inches on center, and 24 on center. That's how we frame our walls, okay? It gives us the strength and structure that we need. It allows us to get lots of insulation in the wall. So we're gonna look at the wall behind me here. And you can see these interior walls back here. Our studs are quite a long ways apart. So I'm just looking at this one wall just right here in the foreground. Interior wall, 24 inches on center. Let's go take a peek at that and see how we've spaced those studs. Okay, so what I've done is I've just laid my tape measure on the floor along with those studs there. And we'll just take a peek in here. Now, what we've got there is we're just simulating the tape measure being hooked on that bottom plate. Okay, so that 2x4 on the floor, and there's our first stud is even with the end of it there. I'm hoping that you can get a shot at it. There you go. Now it may not be 100% accurate because the wall is already built. What we're going to do is we're just come along the tape, and we're going to take a look at 24 inches. Now, as we take a look at that, we'll see the marks left over from laying this wall out. There's a line there. We've taken 24 inches. We subtracted 3/4 of an inch. It's sitting at 23 1/4. You can see that on the line. We've put an X to the right of the line. In other words, the area we subtracted from. And then lo and behold, somebody's installed a stud on top of it. Okay, so we'll show you how that works later. But the principle here is just to see how it works. Okay, so we'll go another 2 feet. We're looking for 2 feet on center. Come to 48 inches, which is 4 feet. So we're halfway there already because we're only going to 8 for now. We've got a line on there. Stud looks like it's a little bit chewed up and just a little bit off, but not a huge deal, okay? There's our line at 47 1/4, slightly off just because of the error at the beginning of the tape. We're unable to get our tape hooked on there. But in any case, for all intents and purposes, the stud is centered on 4 feet, okay? Keep moving along. We'll get to 6 feet or 72 inches. Do our math, subtract 3/4 of an inch, we get to 71 1/4. Stud to the right, side we subtracted from, stud is installed. There we go. And we'll just keep right on going. And this is where all the wonderment happens. At our 96 inches, okay, which we like to use for a whole basis. That's 8 feet. And our stud is installed. Looks like maybe it's off a little bit. Not the end of the world. There is room for error on this. We try and be as accurate as we can. But again, there we go. So 95 1/4. We've put our line, again, off just slightly because of the beginning of the tape. And then 8 feet is in the center. Now, when I install a sheet of drywall on this wall that was 8 feet long, they'll put a bigger piece on so it goes all the way to the end. But the theory is, especially on an exterior wall, if we use 8 feet sheet on here and we run it all the way across, it will land halfway through our wall stud. That way, there's no waste, there's no cutting. We can continue on with the next sheet and keep right on going. No cutting, no waste. So this minimizes cutting and waste. It's faster, it's more efficient, it's a little bit more environmentally friendly, and it solves a whole lot of problems. This is what on-center measurement is all about. Okay, so what we've got here is we've got two 2x4s. We've just temporarily nailed them together. One representing our bottom plate, one representing our cap plate. So what we're gonna do, here is we're going to grab our tape, we're going to hook it onto the end of our bottom plate. We'll call this the bottom plate, we'll call this the top plate. So what we're going to do, we're just going to come along, we've hooked on firmly, we've got a little bit of tension on the tape. We're going to come along to our 24 inches. We're going to start with 3/4 of an inch, and we're just going to put a small little mark there at 23 1/4. So that'll accommodate our stud. Okay? Now what we want to do from that point on, we just grab our square and we'll transfer the line from the bottom plate to the top plate, just like so. And we'll install our X on the cap plate, or the top plate, sorry, and the bottom plate. This represents where the stud will go, and 24 inches should be right about here somewhere. So remember, as we described before, our first stud we'll go right on this first 1.5 inches of the wall. 24 is here, subtract 3/4. This is where the stud goes, just like in the other wall. So as we progress down our assembly of our bottom plate and cap plate, we'll just move into 4 feet again. We'll subtract 3/4 of an inch. That brings us right here to 47 1/4. I've got that marked on there. We can just take our tape aside. Again, we can just hit our speed square on our line. And there's another one of these issues with the pandemic is we don't have 3 hands. I've got no one to hold the camera, but we'll just gently put that on there, making sure that we're tight. So this is 90 degrees, and we'll just mark our 2 X's on there a little bit. We're square, and that's the 4-foot line. So again, 4 feet is in here somewhere. Subtracting half the thickness of the stud moves back to 47.25. So our stud will be on center at 4 feet. And we can just go back here. See, there's 2 feet on center mark and the beginning. So when we pull from the beginning, 24, back 3/4 of an inch, 48, 3/4 of an inch, and then let's just move and do the whole thing.